This meeting is being recorded.
So welcome to this session of Speak Your Mind by Climobilize. And this time, my guest is Inez Aponte from Growing Good Lives. Inez, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate your taking the time, and here we are.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
So Inez is going to be speaking or addressing the question, why is declaring climate emergencies failed to create meaningful change? And Inez, I'd like to ask you a very simple question. We're talking about three different questions in this event, and you chose this one. Maybe you'll share with us a little bit about why you did make that decision.
Thanks. Yes. So the reason I chose that question was because I very much, of course, am on board with that we have a climate emergency. But for a very long time, I've been thinking whether that is actually the right way to communicate the problem that we're facing. So when I think of people hearing this thing, oh, we're in a climate emergency, one of the first things that comes to mind for me as a storyteller is this the right story? Is this the right story that is going to get enough people on board? Is this the right story for you if you are facing the cost of living crisis and you can't put food on the table? Is this the right story if you're unemployed and you're hearing on the media that refugees are coming and they're taking your jobs away? Is this the right story if you're in a queue for the NHS and you're not going to get your emergency operation? And what I'm seeing is that as much as the truth is that we are in a climate emergency, one of the mistakes I think we make is that the truth isn't necessarily the best way to communicate. Like just telling the simple truth isn't always going to change people's minds or get them on board. So I feel that the language of climate emergencies isn't always helping the ultimate outcome that we want. The ultimate outcome that we want is a world in which we can all thrive. But when we talk about the climate emergency, we talk about a very particular thing that actually has been hijacked by the media in general, as in, here's a climate and here are people. So here is a climate, like when George Bush pulled out of the Kyoto Treaty, one of the reasons he did that, he said, oh, it's because it's going to damage the economy. And he used this idea of, oh, people's jobs. And that's kind of what we're facing. We're facing a kind of narrative problem around the climate crisis, in that we are not using the right ways of communicating what's going on, which is that I always say that actually whatever's happening to the climate, to the earth, is happening to people. We live in an extremely exploitative and extractive economic system, and that's extracting from the earth, it's extracting from people, and it's doing all of that for the sake of profit. But we haven't, like, even though that we know that we might know that in the background, we don't necessarily start with that problem when we're talking about the climate crisis. And what it's done is that it's made it very hard for people who are really struggling, and a lot of us are struggling. A lot of people are frightened, a lot of people are divided. And then coming in with something that's incredibly threatening when people are already struggling with their kind of nervous systems, I just think even though it's the truth, it's not the right story. And so that's the reason why I wanted to chat with you about this, because I just feel there must be another way for us to tell this story. And as a storyteller, the first thing that I was taught was know your audience, know what it is that's going on for them. And then you need to find the story, and that you have your message and you're conveying that through a story, but you have to find the right one. You have to know what really matters to them. And I think the idea that we can approach this with one narrative is very mistaken. I think what we need is communication that really touches on the different issues that are going on for people, which all come back to this extractive economic system. And so for some people, yes, they will say, oh, I'm really connected to nature. I've understood the climate problem. I can understand that problem. But the same thing that's causing the climate problem is causing inequality. And for some people, it might be that they need to talk about inequality. They need to talk about those things first, and then they can start seeing the bigger picture. And for other people, it may be the refugee crisis. Okay, maybe they feel threatened. Well, why is the refugee crisis happening? We can go back to, the climate crisis. We can go back to the economic crisis. So I think thinking that the problem isn't that it isn't true. The problem is that truth in itself isn't the only way, or in fact, is not, not even the best way to communicate on its own what it is we need to communicate. In fact, there is a folktale about the naked truth and the story, and the naked truth is naked and nobody wants to engage with it, and the story is dressed up in the most fantastic ways. And I think we need to think about how we're going to communicate this. So this is my particular issue with declaring a climate emergency. It's really the narrative, not the actual truth, and not what needs to happen, but it's about how we get people on board with what needs to happen.
Very interesting perspective, very different perspective. So you're not you're not taking away for the need for a declaration or understanding of the climate emergency, but you're rather saying that that's not really where the story lies. The story lies at a more systemic level, and it's going to be felt differently by different stakeholder groups or different populations in different locations who are subject to different conditions. So where would you start? Where would you even start? Which is the first one? The purpose of a climate emergency often is to also get, many people say we need to get the politicians to do A, B, C in order to have a certain output. You're saying, well, not necessarily. So where would you go with it?
Yeah. So I guess, again, politicians are one group that we need to communicate with. And I do think that in terms of the political landscape, demanding that politicians do the right thing is it's very clear that they know that there is a climate emergency. I don't think we have to worry about that. They know that there are, again, economic reasons why they won't, and there's reasons to do with power, why they would be trapped or unwilling to do certain things. But I think just to kind of put it into context, so 17 years ago, I became aware of the climate crisis. And I had that same feeling like, everyone needs to know the truth. I'm going to tell everyone the truth about the climate crisis. And I tell you, after a while, nobody invited me to their parties anymore. And it's quite clear that just me going, this is what we need to do, wasn't going to work. And I thought, this is so interesting. I have, my friends are good people. It's not like they're not good people. They're good people. There's something else getting in the way of us responding to this. And I got interested in the economy, and in a particular framework called human scale development, which looks at the economy not through the lens of GDP, but through the lens of fundamental human needs. And it says basically a functional economy is one where your 9 human needs, which it sticks to these 9 particular human needs, if they are met, you have a functioning economy. Whether or not GDP grows is kind of irrelevant to that, because you can actually see that GDP may grow and that you actually start harming some of those needs. So we're seeing now that we're growing GDP. Let's say you're working 40 hours a week, maybe you're working 60 hours a week. GDP is growing and everyone's like, well done, but actually you're no longer seeing your family. You no longer have time for your friends. You're feeling isolated. So that would be seen in the model as a poverty of affection, or a poverty of participation, or a poverty of freedom even. But we don't have that language with which to describe it. When you start looking at that, then you start to see, actually, this system isn't working for most people, even though we keep saying, oh, we must keep growing the economy, then things will get better. So it breaks that narrative, because actually things are not getting better for people. And then you start to see, well, actually, everything you need, all your needs come back down to having a living earth. And so that's the framework that I've been using with people. And I've used it particularly with people who don't care about the climate, because I'm like, okay, you don't care about the climate. Let's see how much you care about your needs being met. And the disconnect we have is that we think we can live in a world where the climate can be destroyed, the earth can be destroyed, we can, break through all planetary boundaries, and we're still going to get our needs met. And that's the narrative that the media and the kind of growth economy keeps telling us, because it keeps wanting us to keep shopping to meet our needs. So, not to say that that's a sort of quick fix, but one of the things I've developed through that work is to start to see that there are different levels at which we can be active around creating the world that we want to see, which would mean addressing the climate crisis, as well as addressing the biodiversity crisis, the inequality crisis. which is some of us are ready to get on the barricade. Some of us are ready to be up there and to protest and to have our voice heard in that way. We call that activism. But there are other ways to engage with this problem for people who are not ready for that. Again, there has to be different ways and different stories of engagement. And the other story of engagement is that you start to build connections in your local community, and you start building that local infrastructure where you can get your needs met without having to import things from far away, creating more ways to really be connected to the place you're in. And then the third one is that we actually have to do a lot of healing from the trauma of this system that we live under. So if people are feeling anxious and frightened, they are not ready to hear your story. They're not ready to hear your message about how bad the climate is. So if we're dealing with large populations of people who are getting more and more frightened, because all you hear about are the wars, all you hear about is the kind of doom and gloom about the crisis, how easy is it going to be for any human being to feel resourced enough inside to say, oh yes, I'm really going to do something about this? Also in a world where they could very easily be distracted. If there was nothing else going on, you might see people, oh yeah, I hear there's a crisis, I'm going to respond with everything I can. But we're living in a world where there is a crisis. On the other hand, there is endless amount of distraction on your phone, endless amount of, binge watching whatever you want. And that's the kind of crisis that we're in. We're sort of in a kind of meaning crisis right now. And I think that's what we need to address. So I'd say that the climate emergency, we need to declare it's almost like a kind of global humanitarian, a humanness emergency that we're seeing right now. And if we were declaring that, we would start to see councils thinking about, how am I going to create spaces where people can be together and work through some of the divisions in this community? How are we going to make sure that our education is really fit for purpose, so that people can actually, rather than just being funneled through the education system to just become another cog in the wheel, they get educated to become full human beings and fully participate in their communities? So following on from a kind of a humanness emergency, we would see all sorts of other actions that are really addressing our well-being in connection with the planet. Because when we call it a climate emergency, we narrow down the field. We keep talking about CO2, and then we end up with these false solutions like electric vehicles. And then don't get me on that one, because I'll have to come back for another whole hour. But so that's what I'm trying to say, is that actually it's the framing of the problem that is ending up not being effective. So it's not the truth. The truth is there. And we have many, many scientists who can back that up. We're not worried about the truth. We're worried about how we communicate. And so calling it a climate emergency is for me too narrow when we're dealing with really a poly crisis.
Interesting that you actually say it's too narrow, because what's going through my mind is that it seems that the issue with the mechanism that we call a climate emergency declaration is the scale and scope of it is actually too big and too overwhelming. Whereas we need to kind of, from what you're saying, make it more local. First of all, call it a human crisis, so that humans can come together at the community level. So we're talking about kind of focusing in a little bit about by virtue of replicating that then globally, or having that same kind of process take place globally, then that's how we get the accumulated effect that we want. How do you see possibly, for lack of a better word, I'm going to lump them together, the politicians and big corporates or big industry, which, I mean, think about the term economies of scale. It's all about working at that large scale. And here we're talking about actually focusing it and bringing it down a little bit. How do you see that possibly being reconciled?
Well, I think this is the thing about, I think people have used the word glocal. We have a global world, but we need to focus on the local. And again, when you look at the 9 fundamental needs, and I can send you a chapter that I wrote where it sets it out in more detail, but one of those is like identity, and another one is participation. So it is very hard to have a global identity. We think we have global identities, but really we are brothers and sisters. We are people in our communities, and so when we try and stretch that too far, I think what we end up is not actually having a really strong sense of identity. And I think it's kind of complex, because I guess what you say, about, yes, it's too big for people to deal with. To a certain extent, it is too big to deal with. So if you bring it down to doing something in your local community, it also strengthens the web of relationships that you need. And as this crisis deepens, you are going to need those relationships more and more and more. And everything that we get told about, oh yeah, you can ship your pineapples from Costa Rica, it's like that's all going to end. It might not end for the elite. They're going to be serving themselves while this goes on, everything that they're still used to, but it's going to end for most ordinary people. So finding ways to becoming aware of that, first of all, but then rather than, oh, I'm not going to get my coffee, think, what can I still get from my community? And how do I strengthen that community? And without forgetting that we are we are a global society. So we use the technologies that are useful for that globalization. So now I'm talking to you, you're all the way in Israel, I'm in the UK, that's wonderful, we can communicate with lots of people, but without forgetting the importance of the local. So as this global economy starts to collapse, because it will collapse, that's where we're going to need to, without ignoring the larger scale, we're going to need to focus on that local. So in terms of politicians, I mean, I think what I'm seeing, what I'm feeling most hopeful about are the things that are happening on the kind of municipal scale, where cities are, declaring a climate emergency, or they're declaring some kind of emergency that they're going to respond to. I am not sure that we can look to governments right now to be as effective, because so many of them are in bed with big business. Everything is on that large scale, and the large scale cannot solve the problem because the large scale is the problem. So how can you expect the large scale to solve a problem that it's actually creating? So yeah, that's what I'd say, is that the strength needs to come from the people. And whenever people say, oh, what can I do? If a lot of us join together, we can do something. The problem is a lot of us are now divided. So this is where we are losing our strength, because we are fighting over the crumbs. We're fighting over the tiny detail, when we have to see that actually there is a small but powerful elite of people who are making a lot of decisions, who are really shaping how we see the world. And again, we come back to that story. What are you reading in the media? What vision do you even have of humans? And the vision that we've had of humans in terms of the economy is that we're all selfish. We're all out to, for ourselves. And what we actually see, and we saw that during the COVID crisis, we had a moment. It was terrible, but we saw a lot of community engagement. We saw a lot of people, endless WhatsApp groups trying to help each other. So where is economic man in that? Nobody was thinking, am I going to get paid for this? People were thinking, no, there's something that needs to be done. And I think people are desperate for something to do. So anytime you say it's a crisis, you have to say, this is what you can do. And it doesn't matter if it's a small thing you can do, but do all of this together. Find your people. Do this for each other. Because really, I think as much as we get told about, that we're driven by fear, I think we're ultimately driven by love. But we need the opportunities to start giving that love, and to start doing the thing that we know is going to work, and to break out of that fear. I think the fear is very paralyzing. So I'm worried about messaging that is only about the bad things that are going to happen with the climate crisis. They will happen, and other things will happen. There are opportunities there that we need to grasp. While we're here, there's plenty to get on with. So let's keep telling people what they can get on with in whatever shape or form.
It's interesting. Previous speakers have also, they also seem to come to that same conclusion, that it's the scale that needs to be addressed. Where if we can come back and start operating at a community level, where you understand the local context, it brings people together with a sense of optimism and the ability to take action. Just doing something seems to be empowering. And then you combine that with the additional fact that when communities come together, they become that much more resilient. And the first thing that always goes when you have these massive catastrophes is the federal or the national ability to provide a local service or local resiliency or local emergency support. And then the community steps in. So it almost seems that there's several different layers, and it all comes back down to that issue of scale and focus. Instead of trying to operate at that macro level, let's try and focus in at the micro level. And then by virtue of doing that, by having multiple communities all over doing that, that's how we're going to get the necessary impact. Very, it's interesting just to see how how the same message seems to be coming out one another. Small is beautiful. What did you say? Local as well. Local resiliency, local self-sufficiency. So Inez, very, very interesting. I really appreciate this. If there's one takeaway or one final thought or two final thoughts that you'd like to leave the audience with, what would they be in terms of, forget the discussion about a climate emergency. It's if we do this, we're going to, along the way, deal also with the climate emergency. Where would you, what would you,
Yeah.
it seems to me that's where you're going. How would you like to have people remember that?
I guess maybe I'm repeating myself, but I think when we pay attention to, I guess it's different ways of paying attention. And again, the framing, so when we're frightened, we pay attention in a particular way. Our imaginations, it's not that we have not enough imagination. Our imaginations get hijacked by the fear, and then we imagine all the worst things. So I guess my invitation is to really protect our imaginations, is to try, when you watch yourself doom scrolling, you have a choice. You can think, okay, for this hour that I'm doom scrolling, I could also go and do something that makes me feel positive, and then try and kind of replicate that or plant a seed with other people. So invite someone for a coffee and don't talk about the climate crisis. I know it's very scary, but talk about something that gives you joy, and talk about how you might spread that joy with other people. Talk about, at the moment, I'm running a project here where I bring people together and we just share our stories and we come together and people are in the room. So the other thing that I think is really important is be with real people as much as you can. There's something about what happens to your nervous system when you're with another person. You don't even have to talk. You will just be co-regulating your nervous system. Be calm with another person. Find something to do that helps you feel grounded, because that's the kind of resource that you're going to need as things, go forward. And we have to keep strengthening that bit in ourselves that is strong and that feels whole and it feels grounded. So I would say start there and start with that kind of listening, that kind of attentive listening that you can do to someone, because it's incredibly healing to be listened to. And right now, there's a lot of shouting. Everyone's got an opinion. So, let that person even have their opinion, and then maybe ask them a kind of interesting question that deepens what's going on for them. Because behind all of the opinions, there are fears, there are concerns, there are desires, there are passions, and we need to get to sort of like much more of the core of what's going on for humans. Because I think that there is a way in which we can come to things if we are together and we feel safe. So creating as many opportunities to be safe with other people and sharing the things that are still good. For those of us who have the luxury to have the good things in life, we need to share them and grow some of that goodness together.
It almost seems like it starts with being transparent and accountable to ourselves in a way that when we connect with ourselves, then we're going to bring other people into those circles, and we're going to then we're going to begin acting in such a way that if it replicates and grows, it's going to have a follow-on impact in a way that will hopefully be positive in terms of the environmental effect and all of the rest of the stuff, which ultimately at the end of the day is what is the supposed goal of declaring this climate emergency, this declaration of a climate emergency. So it's a very different approach for getting to that ultimate end result. Interesting, definitely.
It's about starting with connection. I'd say start with connection, connecting to yourself, connecting to others, connecting to the world.
Interesting. It's something that I'll definitely be thinking about. It's not an approach that I've ever considered before, but different ways to get to the same end goal. But look, Inez, this has been really interesting. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
it's great, and I'm looking forward to the new year, and I hopefully we'll be able to start building on this, and we'll see where it goes. There's certainly a lot to be done.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Inez.